Greetings, friends. Juan Ingriski here, and in this video, I'm going to show you guys what we should expect from the Russian summer offensive of 2024. Now, I don't have like the magic secrets. I don't have the magic sauce. The only people who actually know are higher up than me. But I could give you, based on someone who has autistically followed this war every day, and just based on following the trends of what we should expect from a Russian summer offensive. And this is for the more layman of the audience, people who are casual observers of this war, but don't necessarily might put together some want to know some details that they might give them a better informed view of what they should expect. And a lot of people like seeing these expectations. So, in terms of the Russians are going to be on the offensive in this summer, for the summer of 2024. The Ukrainians are still trying to rebuild, regather men, and, they won't be able to get some force together to do any sort of, even attempt to do a counteroffensive until at least next year. So this year is going to be the year of the Russian offensive. So the Russian summer offensive is going to be, there's a lot you could, you have to first think in terms of from the strategic, and then we'll go down to the tactical. What is the Russian strategic goals? If you look at the war goals of the Russians, is that they want to capture these four oblasts of Ukraine: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. So they want to fully capture these oblasts in full. Now, there's certain oblasts that, they don't claim, but also would help them in achieving this goal. And this is where Kharkov comes in. So obviously, we've been talking about the summer offensive in Kharkov that started last week. And, we always talk about, the progress that's happening there. Like, what's the purpose of it? Are they trying to capture Kharkov? Now, yes, I think it is true that I think in the Russian war plans that Kharkov is a prize they want. They want to take Kharkov as part of the spoils of war. They just don't have it as an official war demand yet. However, regardless if it isn't, taking Kharkov actually focus. Now we're going to go down the operational level. In terms of the strategic goal, in terms of just the stated war games of these four oblasts, let's talk about all of them in that gives us a good clue of what's going on. When it comes to focus from the beginning was the Donbass. That's been the main goal of the Russians. They took Kherson and Zaporozhye because they wanted to have the land bridge. But, in terms of Kherson, they have the huge Dnieper River that basically prevents the Russians from getting any sort of bridgehead and maintaining it. They can't take the rest of Kherson Oblast. So the rest of Kherson Oblast, for all intents and purposes, unless the Ukrainians completely collapse, is out of reach. Taking Zaporozhye, which is split in two, will be a high bar to reach. And not only that, taking Zaporozhye will require them to take Donbass first, because they need to secure their flanks, or else it'll be this giant, if they try to attack northwards across the fields, it'll be very bloody, and they'll be protruding, very high up here, and, the Ukrainians could attack them from the flanks. So, and the Donbass, however, was the stated war game since the beginning of this war. It was like no NATO, and also we're going to liberate Donbass. So whatever Russian summer offensive is going to be, my estimation is that it's going to be focused on helping the Russians secure the most out of the Donbass front. Now, this is where Kharkov does play a role in there. You're like, well, Kharkov isn't part of Donbass. How does that play into it? Well, I'll explain that in a second here. So I think, and in terms of what we should expect, a lot of people are thinking there's going to be some big aerial offensive. The Russians are going to activate some, ghost 200,000 man army that's been hiding that we haven't seen, that no one's picked up, and they're going to invade, and they're going to reach the Dnieper River. That's not going to happen. Maybe, I'm not. There's obviously things could be in play that we're not seeing. I'm not putting that as an impossibility. I'm just saying that in terms of what we should expect, the more higher probability, we should expect the offensive as we've seen it throughout the rest of this war. We saw how the Ukrainian summer offensive went. We saw how the Russian offensive in Avdiivka went. This is slow grinding at the tactical level to achieve operational goals. Now, how does the Kharkov offensive help shape the Russian Donbass offensive? And where will the Russians push? The Russians have about 5-6 months of time before the fall rainy season will make offensive very hard. So in terms of, so they have a lot of months to do it. So, and even in a slow grinding position, they could do a lot. They can improve their tactical situation and improve and further their war games a lot in terms of their strategic games. Now, where does Kharkov come in? Now, in terms of, I think Kharkov is going to be a place that we're going to focus a lot in the Russian summer offensive. But I don't think it's going to take Kharkov. If we look at the estimations in terms of how many Russian troops are actually in this front, even to the Ukrainians, there's at most about 50,000 troops that the Russians have deployed all around the Belgorod front. And while right now the sources say there's only been a few thousand that's been put into the offensive so far, I think even if they sent the entire 50,000 troops to invade Kharkov, that's not enough. If the Russians sent 100,000 at least, then we could start talking about maybe they're going to wanting to start putting pressure on the city. I would expect, if they want to take Kharkov, the city, the second biggest city in Ukraine, I would expect at least 150,000 troops. They need a lot of troops, and they need, if they want to open a new front, stabilize it, and actually do heavy urban warfare, which will be what's required to take Kharkov. However, with the minimum Russian troops here, I think the war aims here is more modest. I think Kharkov is a diversion front. Now, there's many reasons why the Russians opened the Kharkov offensive. Let's talk about that for what we should expect in Kharkov and how this plays into where the Russians might strike in Donbass to achieve their actual main strategic objectives there. First, let's talk about that. One of the main reasons is to thin out the Ukrainian lines. The Russians, by virtue of opening this front, could achieve some other operational goals in Kharkov, which we could explain in a bit. But driving Ukrainian reserves here will basically allow the Russians to attack, do an armored fist or some sort of fist to do a big strike package somewhere in Donbass, maybe in multiple areas. But the more they could thin out the lines here, because the reason why it takes so long to grind through this is because each side has the manpower. Yes, each side is losing a lot, but they have reserves. They could plug the holes. And so if the Russians take a village or two, the Ukrainians could simply fall back. And because it was such a grinding offensive, they already have trenches in the back. It's not like if the Russians or the Ukrainians take the forward defensive positions, that there's nothing behind them. If we look at present satellite imagery, the trenches aren't just, the fortifications aren't just on the zero line. You can see trenches all the way back to Pokrovsk. You can see trenches all the way back here, 50, 60, 70 kilometers behind the actual front line. We see actual trenches, and there's defensive lines very far back. And so, there's places the Ukrainians could fall back to, and they have the troops to make up for the troops that they used up to try to keep the Russians in guarding every village. But if they divert a bunch of troops to a new front, there is less troops that the Ukrainians can use in other parts. And this allows the Russians to, wherever they do their attack, their main offensive, to be able to be more successful and not be blocked and basically regurgitate back into a grinding offensive. Or at least, I'm not expecting a big aero offensive. I'm just saying it might be faster than a village a week. Maybe it's a village every 2 days, every 2 or 3 days. That's still slow, but it's faster than you would expect. That is the main purpose of opening this front. But it's not just just open this front. They need to have the Russians need to create a credible reason of why the Ukrainians want. Because if the Russians just stop here, if the Russians just battle for chancing Lipsy, the Ukrainians going to be like, well, okay, we need to put some troops here, but we don't need to divert strategic reserves. So we don't need to divert a lot of troops there because this is a small force. They need to create a credible threat here, and the Russians aren't just going to achieve a small objectives here. There is a lot of things the Russians can do, even with just a 50,000 strong force, that they could not only threaten something that would require the Ukrainians to put a lot of troops here, but also help the Russians in the big picture. So a smaller thing of this is that they create a small border zone here. This will prevent the Ukrainians from shelling Belgorod, and it will allow the Russians to actually put into conventional artillery range Kharkov. So, and this is what we're seeing in the Lipsy axis. We're seeing the Russians slowly push towards, these outskirts of Kharkov, so that, once they reach Ruski-Tishki, for example, and the Russians could put artillery in Lipsy and start shelling Kharkov. And so, once we, then, the city will start being under siege again, technically. And so this not only helps save the actual international recognized Russian territory, that's a given, and not only will these be distracting, but also there's some. This is where, besides just thinning out the Ukrainian lines in Donbass, this actually could threaten operationally Ukrainian positions in Donbass. Let me show you how. So the Russians are actually going to be put, not only are they going to, maybe expand the border region, kind of maybe push towards here, maybe get right outside the Kharkov ring road. They won't enter the Kharkov city, but they might push maybe to this line, have Stary Saltov to Ruski Tishki, kind of maybe this line right outside Kharkov. The Kharkov city will still be under Ukrainian control, but all the villages in the north here will be under Russian control, bordered by the Sovietsky Donetsk River. But the main thrust, I think, of the Russian Kharkov offensive will not be here. This will be just to pin Ukrainians down, but it will be in this eastern part of Kharkov, this area, between the Oskol River and the Sovietsky Donetsk River, this entire area. This area is where the Russians will, I think, do their main push. Even with 50,000 troops, that is enough to clear a bunch of small towns and villages here. It's not enough to take Kharkov, but it's enough to threaten this area. You might be wondering, okay, but this is part of Kharkov. Well, how does this affect the the Ukrainian defenses in Donbass? Well, let's see here. So let's say the Russians, once they take Volchansk, which is right now being undertaken, which is the main linchpin of the Ukrainian defense here. If Volchansk falls, then the Russians have a gateway to start opening up, going down the Sovietsky Donetsk River alongside the push here. They might reach Stary Saltov here, but they also will go along this highway. And if I'm a betting man, I'm assuming the Russians will open up another front right here and start pushing this way. Meet up in this village of Proktonovka right here. They meet up. Oh, suddenly, this entire, the Ukrainians on this northern tip of Kharkov will be completely cut off, and they will be forced to give up. The Russians don't have to attack this area at all. They could just meet up here, and then the front line will kind of go something like this. And the front line is still flat. The front line, the Russians aren't overstretching themselves. Now let's see what the Russians will continue from this point. We're like, okay, so far so good. So let's look at the front line kind of like this. The Russians could continue moving south along the Sovietsky Donetsk River, using this as a natural defense barrier. Ukrainians can make a stand in this village right here, but I'm betting you this is a small village. This has a few thousand people. It's not like a big town or anything, but it's where the Ukrainians can make a stand. But if this place falls, and the Russians could make it fall by attacking it from the flanks here, they could encircle it, and then it will fall, and then the Russians could reach here and basically use this area that they already have captured and basically push out of here and basically take Durichria. This is another main Ukrainian fortification, and then this again they'll be part of it'll still be the same length of the front line, and this is where it will be very tough for the Ukrainians, because not only will a bunch of Kharkov be taken, let's look, what will happen. Let's go a bit south here. Let's say Durichia falls. Look what happens. The Ukrainians on the Kupiansk-Liman front, their supply lines are going to start being threatened by the Russians. Kupiansk is going to be in danger of being encircled. And this whole area, you might be wondering, okay, but Kupiansk is part of Kharkov, and Liman is, what's so important about this front? Well, so the supply for this area is from the back here, and if these supply routes, these roads that lead into Liman and Kupiansk start getting cut, or at least get put into artillery and FPV drone range, this could very much put a shock in the Ukrainians who are defending this area and force them to go back. And if that happens, then, this will open up the flanks to the main Ukrainian line defense in Donbass. And this is where we start getting into where the Russians will use Kharkov as a way to pressure the Ukrainians. Because not only will this be a threat, so if the Ukrainian lines in Kupiansk and Liman start being threatened, that is as credible defense as if, as Kharkov falling. The Ukrainians will divert forces to prevent the Ukrainians from losing their lines of supply to Kupiansk and Liman. But if they do that, then that will thin out the front. So, and the Ukrainian lines of defense are, they have Kupiansk and Liman as one of their main defense lines. They use the Slavyansk-Toretsk line as their actual main Donbass defense. This is the main Ukrainian line of defense in Donbass, Slavyansk-Toretsk. And then they have Pokrovsk, which is kind of their main, this is like their last defense line. It's like very circular. It's 360 defense. And then they also have like defense along the Vachachka River. And so there's some Ukrainian defenses here which the Russians would like to main ones. There's a lot of defenses everywhere, but there's some places where the Russians want to overcome. So what's our so in terms, if the Russians are going to be threatening here, if that's going to be just a diversionary front, well, where will the main blast be? Well, I think that there's going to be a main push somewhere, but the Russians aren't just going to focus on that one area. The Russians are going to push everywhere. They're going to be pushing Kharkov, as mentioned before, but they're going to be pushing elsewhere as well. My prediction is they're going to be, I think their main push is going to be in this area in Avdiivka. I know we've seen a lot of push, a lot of people, this is where most of the battles have been going, so maybe we have a bias here. But I kind of see this and the Chasiv Yar, which is already being stormed, which is an offensive all on its own. And obviously Chasiv Yar is going to be, in this beginning of this offensive, being one of the main takes that the Russians want to do. I see all these links as interconnected. I see the Donetsk front as interconnected. I see Bakhmut interconnecting with that, and I see that interconnecting with the Liman front. Which, if the Russians will push in these three areas at the minimum, and they will push smally in other places. And they're going to push, I think, equally in three areas, and then wherever it gets the most progress will be where they reinforce with extra reserves. Here's where I think the three biggest Russian pushes will be. I think the Russians are going to hold up somewhere in the middle of the Kupiansk-Liman front. Assaulting Kupiansk directly is very suicidal. As we saw here, the assaulting Liman directly is very suicidal. I think, and the Ukrainians want to hold Liman and Kupiansk, and this is where a lot of their main defenses are. However, here in the middle is where it's just a bunch of little villages that allow them to reach the Oskil River. Now, they're defended, but if the Russians could assemble a force in Swatovo, they could create some sort of shock fist that, they don't need to attack along this entire front. They could attack directly, try to reach the town of Borova. And if they can make a breakthrough here or just slowly cross through here and reach the Oskil River, then, if we go something like this, for example, then not only will they split this defense in half, they'll be able to start running to the north along the Oskil River and start pushing the Ukrainians towards Kupiansk and start pushing the Ukrainians towards Liman. This will put pressure on both of these main strategic hubs, and then they will, not only will this put more pressure on Kupiansk along with the Russians from the outskirts of doing the offensive in Kharkov, but I think this will interplay with the Bakhmut front. So, in terms of Kharkov and, solidifying their defenses here, of course, Kupiansk is part of the broader Kharkov kind of operation to drag Ukrainian reserves. But here's where Liman comes in. So let's say the Russians make a big breakthrough and reach the Oskil River in the middle of this area. And, let's say they start moving down this area. And, they start, and this is the Sovietsky Donetsk River here. We see it like this. It's like this. But if we see it like this, the main Ukrainian defense line in Slavyansk-Kramatorsk, if Liman falls, will be in danger from the north. Because if the Russians hold Liman, let's say Liman falls after a grueling siege here, here's how it interplays. Right now the Russians are sieging Chasiv Yar. This will be one of the main places the Russians want to take. The Russians will push and try to, have the front line kind of go like this, and have the dominant heights in Chasiv Yar. Here, well, let's look what happens when the Russians have Chasiv Yar and Liman. Well, look here. Not only will they threaten Slavyansk from the north, from the back here, and not only will they have the dominant height here to assault it, or at least put pressure on it directly. Now, they can't assault it directly. That'll still be a bit suicidal. But here's what's going to happen. They could then kind of squeeze out the Ukrainians from Seversk, which, and they only, this will flatten the front line for the Russians. and force the Ukrainians back. And this will allow the Russians more easier time to pin the Ukrainians on their main defense line. So not only will the Russians be on the back of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk front with this push, this will help flatten the Bakhmut front. But then this also interplays with the Donetsk front. So let's say what happens that the Russians have Chasiv Yar. Let's say they take, they're assaulting Seversk, and the front line is now maybe, say, 10 or 15 kilometers outside the main Ukrainian defense line of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, and Toretsk. Well, so one push will be to, is to take Chasiv Yar and then split Seversk. But here's how it interplays with, Seversk is just a piece of the pie, a small piece of the pie, not the main one. Same thing with Kupiansk. Just as Liman will be the main treat and Chasiv Yar is the main treat here, the main treat here is going to be the Russians exploding out of here, and this will be where the Russians might do their main offense. This might be, because they made a lot of progress here, this might be like a bias. But, the thing is, this has a very good chance of splitting the Ukrainian defenses and, so, let's say they push here. We talked about this before. They could cut the last Ukrainian defenses in Pokrovsk, and with the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, Toretsk line. But not only that, if they continue pushing north and west here, and the front kind of goes something like this, right? Well then, if the Russians are pushing out of here, well then look what happens if they're in Chasiv Yar, So, if this is the front line, and then, something like this is the front line at this point, right? If this is the case, then look, they could encircle Toretsk. They could encircle it from the back, cut off the linchpin. One of the this is a continuous defense line, and if one part of it falls, this will severely endanger everything else. Because if they could encircle Toretsk from the south and the north, take it. Well, then look, then the front line. If this happens, then the front line will run something like this. And look, then they could take Konstantinovka from the north, from the south. And then also they'll be continuously advancing to take it from the back here, from the west. That'll be three sides. They could continue rolling up this area. At the same time, we could see a push from this area, from Izium, and, it depends on how far the Russians push. But if if the Russians are out here, right, then they're going to be starting to get to the back of Slavyansk. And we will also see, so if we look at the back end here, the Russians will be kind of meeting up. Again, this was kind of like what they were expecting in the beginning of the war, but this was before they could thin out the Ukrainian defenses. But then they just kind of meet up and just encircle this main line of defense. And if this main line of defense falls, then there's really nothing stopping the Russians from taking most of Donbass. There might be a couple areas left, but that the main place will fall, and there'll be a lot of gains here. There's going to be a lot of operational goals which will be achieved. They will basically, they'll have their small border, border. They'll be on the outskirts of Kharkov. They will have taken most of Kharkov Oblast by this point. They would have taken the main line of defense. They would have, and basically the only thing left would be Pokrovsk. Now, so there's gonna be some Ukrainian towns and everything left in Donbass, so I don't think the Russians will completely win over Donbass, but I think this, taking most of it will basically seal its fate forever. And I think that is kind of the main goals of the Russian offensive. I think that is where the Russians will do their main push. The Russians will push in the Kupiansk-Liman front. They will push in Kharkov. They will push in Chasiv Yar, and they will push in the Donetsk front. And but that doesn't mean that'll be all there is. The Russians will continue pushing in the South Donetsk area and in the Zaporozhye area. They're going to continue pushing to try to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. There's going to still be clashes for Krasnogorivka. There's going to still be clashes for Maskalinovka and Hostra. They're going to continue trying to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. They're going to try to flatten this front line. They're going to still try to take Novopokrovska and Novoselivka-Pershi. They're going to continue pressuring the Ukrainians here so they can't move away. Same thing with pinning operations here. The Russians, I'm expecting, the Russians are going to try to start doing an assault on Konstantinovka, and then by extension, maybe they want to assault Ugledar, maybe do some small-scale offensive here. and pin the Ukrainians in the South Donetsk area. We already see this in the Veliko-Novoselivka area, where the Russians are trying to pin the Ukrainians in Staromayorsk and Orozhina. We see the Russians also reverting all the Ukrainian gains in their summer offensive in the Zaporozhye front. Robotyne has been retaken. The Russians are continuing pushing here, so the Ukrainians can't leave their troops from Zaporozhye. With all this in mind, the Russians are going to be pushing on the entire front, with maybe the exception of Kherson. But with that being said, if the Russians are pushing in Kharkov, if the Russians are pushing in Zaporozhye and South Donetsk and pinning their troops there, then the main thrusts in the Oskol front, the Chasiv Yar front, and the Donetsk front will be able to culminate with their main shock fist, where they'll apply their reserve troops. And so, there's gonna be pushes everywhere, but I think all these are going to be kind of small gains, and then the main thrust is going to be in Donbass, and specifically in the three areas because they interlink with each other very well. So that's what I expect for the Russian summer offensive. This could very well drag into the winter, and they might not even achieve their, I'm just saying this is what makes sense from an operational perspective. But, again, there might be other operational goals that they have to take in mind. Maybe the conditions for the army would have to be taken into account. This is not set in stone. This might not even be the goals. But I'm just saying from a strategic perspective, this is what I expect based on what the Russians want to get from their strategic perspective. So that is the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Be sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to continue receiving videos on the updates on the Russian-Ukraine war. Give this video a thumbs up. Like it. Share this video around. Comment your thoughts. And yeah. So aim high and wander on.